land acknowledgements. It's also, I think, really helpful to reflect on what Indigenous teachings can teach us with regards to our particular topic. And so I have been reflecting on the fact that this is a presentation specifically focused on writing, and that there are other ways of transmitting knowledge, particularly through oral methods, through stories. And I think that that can infuse some of the ways that we think about our writing, and that there's also opportunities for the center to think about other ways of knowledge dissemination and how we might run some seminars on different strategies for sharing stories in the future. So I want to start by actually doing a round of introductions. And I actually want to encourage people to write their introduction, since this is a writing-based seminar, and since we're actively using Zoom. And I'd like you to write in the chat who you are. And I want to explain this. I didn't ask you to name yourself, although I would like to know your name. I specifically asked you who you are, because writing is, as Thompson and Comler suggest, it's identity work. We're often trying to take a stand in the academic context of writing journal articles. We're positioning ourselves as authority figures. For myself, I am a health geographer, and I'm often writing about the value of my particular perspective on a topic or an issue. And so that's part of what we mean by identity work. So if you could maybe write a few things, your name, what disciplinary perspective or training are you kind of bringing to the issues that you're writing about? And what is one piece that you're writing? So this could be a master's thesis. This could be a journal article. If you're like me, you have a journal article that you started writing the methods on last week. Then you have one that's almost ready to send to publication that you've been working on for a year. And then you have a student paper that you've been really helping them to craft. And so maybe you have multiple writing projects, but just pick one and share something that you're writing on. So yeah, I'd welcome you to write a bit about who you are and what you're writing in the chat. And I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Thank you, Wayne, for sharing your pains. I hope I can share some suggestions that are useful to you. And Andrea, we've got multiple people on this revision process. Maybe we need to do a specific seminar on revisions. Very interesting topics. Shannon, I'm really curious to hear more about your research as well. Or it's cool to see some of the other things that you're working on. All right. I've have some articles that have taken forever, and some that were easier to write, I think. But none of them were really that easy. So Laura, I can definitely empathize with the sense that it's taking forever. Hannah, thanks it's nice to have a Mel student joining us. And it's nice to have such a cross section of people in different disciplinary areas. And I don't intend, I don't intend to speak as an authority. I think we can use the chat, and if you feel like you want to pipe in moving forward, and speak, then I certainly welcome that. I just wanted to get us thinking about writing and actively writing at the start of this workshop. And kind of throughout, I thought that it might actually be useful to do some planning about our writing together, and maybe even share different strategies that we've been using. So, as I said, I'm not an authority on writing and publishing journal articles. I've done it, but I'm still learning. So now that we have a bit of a sense of who's here, I'm going to move to my next slide, and I'm going to give you a bit of background about me. I'm a developing writer. I actually started my academic journey, well, actually, even before I went to university, I really enjoyed writing. I took, multiple high school English classes, that, like, some of them were some elective classes. I had a class where I wrote essays every day with pen and paper in class for 3 weeks. And just got, feedback on my writing. And I think through that process, I really learned about the importance of writing for thinking, that writing is a form of thinking, and that you have to keep writing to write better, right? So those were really important formative lessons for me. I know this is about writing peer-reviewed journal articles, but I think it's important to recognize that we come at this from different disciplinary backgrounds. And for me, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be a geographer or study English literature. And so when I went into my undergraduate studies after my first year at Trent University, I actually decided to do a joint major in English literature and human geography. And so this kind of shaped my exposure to writing, my understanding of, close reading and form and context in writing in ways that I understand if you're coming from a science discipline, or maybe you were trained as a nurse first, you didn't have those same, opportunities in your kind of early academic career. So everyone comes at writing from a different perspective. I was also that student who went to academic skills instructors with every essay that I wrote in my undergrad. And so this smiling face at the top of the screen is Erin Stewart-Eves. You can Google her. She's a self-proclaimed Trent lifer. And she actually went through the same master's program as me, but a few years before me. And so I would even visit her with chapters of my master's thesis. And so I really got to develop my writing with a very supportive writing infrastructure in the universities where I studied. When I moved forward in my in my education, and I went to Queen's, they had something called Thesis Boot Camp. And so this was 1 week where they got every student together. They fed them lunch. They'd start out with maybe 10 or 15 minutes of reflection, goal setting, and then you had to put your computer on airplane mode. You could not check your email. You could not edit your work, or you were discouraged from editing. You were supposed to just write new things. This is a habit I have. Sometimes I look at my articles and I just edit and edit and edit, and I'm not writing new things. And it actually makes it really hard for me to make substantive structural edits because I'm so tied to it by the time I'm done writing. So these were important lessons as well. And I've been fortunate to be a part of some different writing retreats and writing groups, and also to read different writing books. So I have like a style guide, right, that, while very old, I still think is interesting if you, and important. It's, you know, the kind of guide that's written so that you could fit in a pocket, by Strunk and White. And so, you know, you want to check about misused words and, you know, have an authoritative version. Of course, you can find a lot of things on the internet too. So I've had a lot of different resources. And in fact, recently I checked this book out of the library. So I've published various things, but I'm still learning. And this is Writing for Peer-Reviewed Journals, by Thompson and Kamler. And I will share some of the things that I've learned from that. My reason for checking this out of the library was because I was working with a number of research assistants and feeling like I really need to know more about how to write peer-reviewed journal articles. Like, there's a way that I've done it, and it's not the same every time. And how do I teach this? How do I keep developing this skill? So I don't know if at the beginning of my career I would have had the confidence to check out a book on writing peer-reviewed journal articles. And I think that's interesting. I think it's important for us to feel like we can actually ask for help and develop our skills. I'm just going to check and see if there's anything I need to look at in the chat, and we're good. Any questions about any of the different sort of resources that I've just mentioned before I move on? Okay. So another resource that Jonathan Allen actually referred me to is Jo Van Avery. So Jo Van Avery is a writing coach. She's based out of the UK. And she has really helped me kind of structure my writing and develop a writing practice. So to write a peer-reviewed journal article, it takes developing a writing practice, not just writing skills, but this sort of active, ongoing commitment to writing. So in my calendar, you will see, if you looked at my Outlook, that I actually set regular meetings with my writing. And I try really hard not to let other people and other causes sort of crowd out that writing. It helps if you schedule your meeting with your writing at 8 a.m., but that doesn't always work for everyone. So those meetings could be 30-minute meetings. They could be 90-minute meetings. I would suggest that 90-minute meetings are probably the most useful, to have a couple of those in a week, so that you can really get into things. But some books are written about writing a dissertation in 15 minutes a day. So setting that time is important. We're actively writing, not just editing things, and also setting goals. So what is your weekly goal? What is your monthly goal? What is your quarterly goal? Maybe at best you could write a journal article in 3 months. I think that it takes a fair bit of time to do that. I have journal articles that, like the one I'm working on right now, it has taken me the last year to write it. I have other ones that have been a bit shorter in terms of preparing them. So it really depends on the nature of the article. And I think some of the emotional labor that's involved, because sometimes the topics that we're trying to discuss are heavy and difficult, and the data may be one of the things that's also really challenging to navigate. So different articles take different periods of time, but setting goals, and then making sure that you're actually able to build in boundaries and some slack in your schedule. This is something I really suck at, to be honest. I never have slack in my schedule. So I welcome suggestions from others who are attending about ways to build in some slack. But the important thing is that I've been able to identify that, and I've been able to kind of shift some of my expectations by recording and reflecting on my progress. So I've fallen out of practice of doing this, but I do highly recommend it. I kept a work journal for several years during the peak of the COVID restrictions. And every day I would just do some reflective writing about what I was learning, what I was doing at work. Sometimes it was to-do lists, but I also forced myself to think and reflect on what is meaningful in my work and that I'm learning, because that's kind of a cool part of being in the academic world, whether you're a student or a professor, is that like your job is to learn. And that's kind of a wonderful thing. Any questions about some of these writing practice suggestions or anything you want to add that's working for you?
I'll jump in, Rachel. I know what it's like on the other end when no one talks. So, hello everyone. I'm Cora, and I wanted to do more writing, and I know that I do better in groups. Like I thrive better in a group setting. And so myself and Dr. Dominic Heitu co-created a writing group, and there's 6 or 7 of us that meet Wednesday mornings. And we get together, and like, so that's a sacred time, and not everyone can come every week, but that's kind of built into my writing practice is by doing it with others, so that there's kind of this shared accountability and routine to it too. And it's something that we look forward to.
Awesome. I'm glad that there's already some informal writing groups happening across campus. I appreciate that. I have a colleague at U of M who has like a group of people she's started to add to a Zoom writing group, and she coordinates that. And yeah, all we do is start the meeting with, what are you working on today? And happy writing. Like it's just nice to be accountable. And yeah, I see Andrea's writing regular research and writing slots into her calendar. Wayne?
Hi, actually, one of the 15-minute a day sort of approach, I actually used that to write a chunk of my dissertation about 3 years ago.
Wow.
And one of the things that I did to get over writing block was I used something called the Most Dangerous Writing app. And it's one of those apps, and I can toss it into the chat. It's one of those apps that once you start typing, if you pause, it's going to delete your work. And so it's really
God.
Yeah, yeah. So a stream of
I could
consciousness.
not do that.
You can set your goal, so it's like 250 words or 500 words. It was amazing how quickly you can crank out 250 or 500 words just once it gets flowing and you're forced to keep going. Now, after I would edit it, it would, maybe I'd use a quarter of it, maybe a third, and on a good day, half. But I often found that that would set me up for like a half hour of writing after that, and I'd keep going with it. And I stopped fighting it. I used to try and write after work at night, and then I realized I had no mental headspace. I had no slack at the end of the day. So I ended up getting up. My brain was getting me up at 4 or 5 in the morning, as this sort of built the pressure on this. And so I would just write for half an hour, most days. And I found, I think I wrote about half my dissertation that way. So.
Wow. I find this hilarious because I think I'm like often a pause and reflect person. And so I would fail with this app, but I understand. I think it's such a great tool, as you're saying, to get you warmed up. And like, I do think there's great value to starting with free writing and and just forcing yourself to write, as you say, like, that's cool. Thanks for sharing that. Rong Yu, I think like that's a really important point. I often feel myself, I feel I'm more inspired if I actually have some time even to read like novels. I remember that writing is a creative process, right? And so sometimes that can be really helpful too. All right. So I want to spend some time actively kind of planning our writing a bit. So I want you to, you don't have to share this in the chat if you don't want to. But I want you to think of what writing project needs work this week. Do you have what you need? Is the data, you know, in a at a stage, I would say, that you're ready to write about it? Do you have the sources you need? Is there a deadline coming up? If you have multiple writing projects and you have to choose what you're working on this week, because there are multiple things you need to work on, what is the most meaningful and what's the closest to being done? Sometimes it's helpful to choose the thing that's closest to being done, because it's kind of motivational to get things done. Gosh, a couple of people said in the chat, like, this is taking so long. So sometimes it's useful to finish something. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that we should be writing things that are meaningful for us, for others in the world, and also for our career. And so having that kind of like guiding star for us can be also a very helpful motivation to get writing done. So identify that writing project, you know, based on that series of questions or prompts. What is the thing you're going to work on this week? It's Wednesday. You've got 2 days left. Maybe you're writing on Saturday or Sunday. But let's assume that you work a 40-hour work week and and that you're not going to use your entire weekend to write. What does this project need to move forward? Don't say a literature review. Literature reviews take, in my experience, a literature review is quite a chunk. It's like at least 3 chunks, 4 chunks of writing. It takes me probably the longest. I've learned that I could probably sit down and write a methods section easily in 90 minutes and have a reasonably good methods section for a paper. I find that pretty easy because I'm just telling people what I did and why I did it that way and why it's important or novel or so that type of writing, very descriptive, doesn't really involve the same kind of, for me, deep thinking, critical analysis of a literature review that I think takes more time. So try to think about a manageable chunk. What could you do in, say, 90 minutes? And then maybe think about whether there are other things you're juggling that you need to work around. And do you have a meeting set with your writing? I like the kind of metaphor of juggling because I think that we do often have multiple things, whether they're life or work or just multiple facets of life or work or fun that we're trying to balance. I do think that dropping balls is also a good metaphor for us. And it's okay if you've dropped the ball on a writing project. You didn't get as far as you wanted to, or maybe you owe a colleague that literature review. I think that to be a better juggler, you have to drop some balls to kind of figure out how do you do this? How do you become the Zen juggler? So I think rather than write this in the chat, yeah, if anyone wants to share at this point something that they're working on, and what chunk they need to work on, when they're going to work on it, just to kind of keep us accountable to one another. I think it might be a useful practice. So I could say, I'm starting to, this week, I really need to advance a paper. I wrote the methods section. I've written a paragraph of the introduction. I have started to look at interview transcripts. I have a breakfast meeting with my colleague Nancy Newell, and we discuss interview transcripts at our breakfast meeting, just to kind of keep us moving forward in the analysis. But it's due as a part of a special issue in April, and April 1st. And I realized that I do need to make more progress on it because there's a deadline, but also that it's really meaningful for my career. It's like methodologically quite unique, and it's topically, important for my area of research. So Friday morning, I plan to focus on this paper. If, however, I get revisions on my other papers that I'm waiting for my colleagues, I might pivot and focus on the other paper that is 95% done. So the important part, I think, is that I've blocked off the writing time. Does anyone else want to share what their plan is for this week?
I'll jump in,
Cora?
Rachel. I think what I'm taking away from what you're saying is like start where you can start, which is not the first time I've heard that lesson. So earlier today, because we had our writing group, I started with the introduction because that's where you start. But it may be easier to jump ahead to the methods because again, it's like writing out a recipe of, these are the steps I took. Just so that I am moving things more quickly and instead of getting stuck in the parts that may be, more layered. So I think that's kind of a logical next step is to stop where I was at and then pick up and move to the methods, and knowing that it's like, I'm using lots of metaphors in this, but it's like a quilt. You kind of, you do these like patches and then eventually you just bring them together to then get your end result.
And I think there are some different, I think different books and different people will guide you in different directions. Some people will say, start with the abstract. I'll give you that version in a few moments. For me, I always start with the methods because I know I can do it. But I think there are different strategies. So I saw some comments. I find the discussion section the most difficult to write. Andrea, thank you for saying that. I usually write it in bullet points and send it to my co-authors. I'm like, I need your feedback. And so this is where I think it can be useful without downloading the labor to someone else, maybe asking specifically to my colleagues, like, how do you think what literature do you think I should draw into the discussion here? Giving them kind of a task, if that is their content area and they're able to do that. And I guess it depends whether you're writing a single author paper or whether you're writing with others. Again, we'll get to that in a moment. So just kind of skipping along because I'm realizing we have lots that we're working on. And it's already 12:30. So most people start with where they want to publish the article. I don't always do this. I can tell you that I sometimes just write the article and that involves a lot of revision, usually. I have kind of my journals that are my go-to journals. So as a health geographer, if I'm writing to other health geographers, I might publish in Health and Place or Social Science and Medicine. Part of why I'm so comfortable with these journals is because I know the rules of the discourse community. I know how it is that authors, scholars in this community talk to one another, even though they're very broad communities, especially social science and medicine includes psychology, anthropology, geography, business, economics, like all kinds of social scientists. But I've read the author guidelines many times, and I've read many papers from those journals. And so I know how to talk to that community. When we are deciding where to publish, we are deciding what type of scholarly conversation we want to have and who we like, how we want to contribute to that conversation. We might say, oh, I want to publish, nurses are my audience, paramedics are my audience, rural business owners are my audience. When it comes to academic journals, we really need to think about the aims and scope of the journal that we're interested in. Obviously, we can look at our literature review and see where many of our sources have come from. If we've gathered a lot of information, what is, maybe you have like one article that really inspires your work and you want to have a conversation with that article. Where is it published? And does your paper fit the mission statement and what the editor says? I have gone to conferences and I've gone to sessions where the editors of Health and Place and the editors of Social Science and Medicine have given presentations about their journals and what they're looking for. I find these really, really valuable. And certainly if you have that opportunity, I think that's good. Other people will say the first place you should start is with the abstract. Abstracts are really tough work. They force us to succinctly communicate our main arguments, our main points. And sometimes when we first start writing, we don't even know what that is, right? Because writing is part of the thinking process. We actually write to know what we want to argue. At least for me, that's often the case. But I find this strategy very helpful. It's called the 4 moves of the tiny text. And so it suggests that every abstract can be broken down into 4 parts. First, you need to locate your article within a particular kind of disciplinary discourse or conversation. So I might say, I often have these sentence skeletons that I'll get to in a moment, but I'll start with drawing together or bridging, this research and that research. I'm going to be looking at this. So I've made a very strategic move to identify which literatures at the very outset I want to bring together or talk to, be in conversation with. And then I focus on a particular question that I want to answer. Sometimes I will write this as, in this article, I explore, or in this article, I ask 3 questions about, I find that kind of writing useful as a reviewer. It's just easier to read. I know what I'm looking for. And so having reviewed papers, I think about that as well. And then the next part is to report. So report on how was the research conducted? What are the data sources? And what are the primary findings? And then argue. This is the hardest part for me. I often don't know what I'm arguing until I have actually written the paper. And so I sometimes struggle to write that section. And I usually write my abstract 3 times before I've actually submitted the paper, right? So you can use this model to actually identify, locate, focus, report, argue. How many words are you going to write in each section of your paper? So if your paper is taking the kind of traditional introduction, maybe the introduction includes the literature review, or there's a separate literature review section. Then you have a methods section. Then you have a findings and discussion. How many words are you going to dedicate to each section? How are you going to use that intro to locate and focus? And maybe are there particular questions? I like to write my outlines as a series of questions that I'm going to answer. I just find that helpful because it makes me get in that kind of more argumentative, or I'm trying to, not argumentative, but I'm trying to prove something, right? So if I kind of outline in a series of questions, I find that useful. And yeah, I think free writing can be useful, but having an outline is important to rein in your thoughts. I have written a number of articles and chapters with my master's supervisor, Mark Skinner, and he said to me once, as we were sitting down to write an outline, structure will set you free. And I think I should have a t-shirt. And I really value co-writing with people who are structured, because I tend to be a little bit all over the place in my thinking, and I really need structure, and sometimes I impose that for myself, and sometimes I'm fortunate to have a colleague who can kind of help me along. So this is just an example of the 4 moves of the tiny text. And I think probably also illustrates what I know is my weakest point as an author. This is the paper that I'd say is 95% done. I have located, I have focused and reported, and the argue part is probably not quite as strong. But you might want to ask yourself, if you're working on a piece of writing, have you done these kind of 4 moves effectively? And how can that help you to move forward with the next step in your writing process? I think it's a useful strategy. You can also look at articles that you really admire and get started that way. You can develop sentence skeletons. So this is, I Googled an article, or I looked at the most cited articles in Health and Place last night, and I deleted the words from the article, but I took the sentence skeletons or structures. So this idea that, you know, there's kind of a certain language, recent surveys say this or suggest this, however, this, only several studies have focused on this, and this study aims to fill this gap by. We have all read a lot of articles that use this kind of sentence structure. I'm not saying you have to use this structure, but it can be useful for us to think about, okay, if we're getting started on writing a new paper, what's a good paper that we really love, and what are some of the techniques or moves that they use to identify what we already know, how we can advance knowledge, and kind of make our argument a little bit clearer, sometimes for ourselves, but also in the end for our reader. I'm a big proponent of the reverse outline. I reverse outlined my entire PhD dissertation and used it to kind of prepare for my defense. Basically, it's a process of looking at each paragraph and asking, what is this paragraph about? What is the primary point? And that can be really used to tighten up writing, but it can also be used to move things around, because sometimes when we actually start to do a reverse outline, we realize that things that we wrote are not really flowing very well. And so it can be helpful to reorder things so that the flow is better. You might also look at your titles and headings and kind of use the metaphor of if the titles and headings are road signs, are you like out there in the middle of nowhere? You have no clue where you are, in which case you probably need more headings for your reader. They're totally lost. Or are there just too many signs altogether? I know, again, many journals have specific requirements But I think even for an introduction, if they want you to use the heading introduction, you could have a colon that actually does more work for you, that says, what is this introduction about, right? And so there are some good examples of kind of making those headings and titles really work for you. And then also in terms of refining your article before publishing, I think one of the things I've been noticing lately is that some journals that I submit to actually have specific author guidelines about being parsimonious with your references. And so they don't want you to have 3 or 5 or 6 references for a thing, but to choose, the most effective references. And that comes back to what is the conversation that you really want to have, and who is the conversation that you're really, who is the person that you're really having this conversation with? Yes, you've probably read a lot of things, but some people would actually start to remove references that maybe aren't as relevant to what they're trying to argue. Not all of us are writing alone. As I've been thinking about writing and how to support students and research assistants, I realize that sometimes when I don't understand what they're saying, I'm not as supportive of their kind of identity work, recognizing that they're trying to figure out how to become an authority, and so that's something that I'm trying to work on. But generally, we should try and support our co-authors in different ways. I have actually, with Candace Waddell-Henowich, I have actually started writing an article once, years ago now, where we literally sat together and wrote sections together. That does not work for everyone, but that's one form of collaborative work that if you do have a really good working relationship, I like writing. And so I would be the scribe, and Candace would talk at me, and we would kind of bounce things back and forth. And I think when you do have those kind of beautiful collaborative relationships where you can create that space, that can be productive. But I was trained really to write the first draft and then send it to my co-authors. I think increasingly we see more collaborative work where people divide sections and try to kind of piece it together. That does present challenges if you're trying to create a single voice. And so often we need to be really clear about what it is that we are trying to communicate and what tone we want to set. And some scholars even advocate that we should be kind of interviewing people before we start collaborating on a writing project. Like, what do you do have you ever not met a timeline? What do you do if you can't meet a timeline? How do you work through differences in, style? Or there are a lot of challenges to writing together, but it can be really beautiful. So not all collaborations work, but I do want to acknowledge that there is often a lot of collaborative work in writing. Multiple people mentioned responding to reviewers as a pain in the butt. I agree. But I always start with thank you for the opportunity, usually to strengthen our manuscript. See, it says in this example, thank you for the opportunity to revise and resubmit a stronger manuscript. I try to remember that this is what this process is about. I do a lot of collaborative writing, so I share my reviewer responses with co-authors as soon as I get them. If I'm angry, if I'm sad, if it's like a complete rejection, I need my people to back me up. So don't hold on to your revise and resubmit. Don't hold on to your outright desk reject. Share it. If you're not working on this piece with someone else, find a friend, call me up, tell me that you're really disappointed, and I'll hear you, right? This is part of the process. Oftentimes it's not because it's not good. There are reasons for this. I start on writing the letter before I make any revisions. I use the letter as my roadmap to how I might make those revisions. So I'll put, sometimes in this version, I've just done comment and response sequentially. Sometimes I'll set up a table and I'll do comment in one side and response on the other side. And I'll start writing out what it is. You don't have to do everything the reviewer says, obviously, but you need to defend why you're not doing it. So recently someone said, what was it? Something about qualitative methods. They said they wanted me to make a statement about naturalistic, that this is, I can't even reframe it quite. In any case, it was a very positivistic understanding of qualitative research. And I wasn't going to do that because I knew I didn't have to do that. And so I made an argument about why I wasn't going to do that. So I start with the letter first, and then often go into the document, make comments where I'm going to make those changes, and then start at making those changes. And that's part of my process. Sometimes we have to learn to decipher what the reviewer is really saying. And there is kind of an art to that. And again, I think the book by Thompson and Comler is really good. And I think they actually have a specific book focused on responding to reviewers as well. So often if we get an outright rejection, we have chosen the wrong journal. We are not speaking the right discourse, or we're not speaking to the aims and scope of the journal. Maybe we haven't read the author guidelines if it's too long or too short in terms of their word count. That could be part of the reason. Poor writing, and maybe it's seen as not a significant contribution or not broad enough for an international audience. You know, we wrote a paper about Brandon, Manitoba. Well, so what? Like, how does this apply to other places? We often maybe don't situate it that well, or maybe we situate it in a Canadian context, but not for an international readership. And that's what the journal is speaking to. Or we lack theory or lack of references, or things are just sloppy and not proofread properly. So I've gone through this really quickly. I realized we could have done this in maybe 2 hours and had a little bit more interaction. But I do want to turn it over to you to kind of sum things up. I recognize that writing is hard, that writing forces us to think through what we know, and it takes a lot of time to do that, that it can be a really meaningful part of the research project. But I also said that in the very title of this presentation that this would be an invitation. And so I wanted to ask those attending to kind of weigh in on how we might develop a more supportive writing culture, not only through our research center, but in the university more specifically, and just kind of open up that conversation. So I welcome comments in the chat, and also if you want to share your voice, I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad you're interested in the idea of a writing group, and I'm sure, Wayne, you're not the only one who struggles. I should say that in addition, I have a slide of some resources that might be helpful to folks. If you want to learn more about the dissertation boot camp idea or the development of a writing community, also there's a ton of books written about how to write a lot or how to write a journal article. And I've also included some of my favorite grammar and kind of style guides too.
Rachel, I actually have a copy of the Belcher book, right? It's sitting on my desk, writing your journal article in 12 weeks. And actually that was the origin of why creating the writing group, although that we haven't used this book as our guiding force, or someone mentioned having a theme, but maybe that's a next step, or in a different writing group, creating writing your journal article in 12 weeks, sort of, if people feel like they could be part of a structured timeline. And so if that's something the center wants to organize, then I'd certainly be happy to join in on that.
If there are people who are interested in forming a writing group and you want us to collect kind of emails and coordinate something, I'd be happy to facilitate that. If you don't already have a writing group, it sounds like there's folks in Winnipeg who are really interested in having something in person, but maybe they could also Zoom in with us, or we could find ways to help facilitate that. I appreciate that this process can be really lonely, but I also know that it can be a fun social process too. So yeah, if folks are interested and they want to share, leave their email in the chat and just mention that. I'd be happy to facilitate. Maybe I'll stop sharing so I can see all your faces too. Any questions? I realize we have 4 minutes. Well, I'm really happy. I thought no one would show up. So thank you for attending. And yeah, if you have questions that you don't want to share online with everyone else, but that you'd like to share through email, I certainly welcome that as well. And just really appreciate that there's an interest in this, because yeah, I think it can be lonely, but we can also create a more supportive culture. So thanks to everyone for showing up, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Tracy, do you know whether I can copy the chat, or is it only you can copy the chat?